At first glance, it may seem that the A380 lost on its own because it turned out to be too big and too expensive for the new market. But if you look more closely, the picture becomes more interesting. Airbus built the aircraft for the era of giant hubs, in which everything was supposed to depend on maximum capacity. At the same time, Boeing was pushing a completely different logic. And it was this logic that gradually turned the A380 into an aircraft for a world that was beginning to disappear. At the moment when Airbus decided to create the A380, the idea seemed entirely logical. By the late 1990s, major airports were overloaded, passenger traffic was growing, and free slots at the most important aviation hubs were becoming increasingly scarce. If flights could not be added endlessly, then the most obvious solution was to increase the size of the aircraft itself. That was exactly the bet Airbus made. The company assumed that the future of long-haul aviation would be built around a few ultra-large hubs through which enormous passenger flows would pass. In that model, the A380 was supposed to be an almost perfect aircraft, huge capacity, lower seat costs, and the ability to carry even more people in a single departure. But Boeing had already started moving in a different direction before the A380 even appeared. The company already had a very strong example in the form of the 777. That aircraft showed that a twin-engine wide-body could be not only efficient, but also commercially far more attractive than heavier and more expensive four-engine machines. For the market, this mattered not only because of fuel consumption. Two engines meant simpler operations, lower maintenance costs, and a completely different flight economics model. Against that background, Airbus had already gone through a painful experience with the A340, which was gradually losing precisely because of this logic. And here the main paradox of the whole story appears. Seeing how the market was increasingly shifting toward more efficient twin-engine aircraft, Airbus did not retreat into that same segment, but instead moved even further toward a large four-engine flagship. On paper, it looked convincing. If airports like Heathrow, Narita, or JFK were constrained by slots, then one aircraft carrying more than 500 passengers could genuinely offer an advantage. Airbus marketed the A380 as an aircraft for the world's busiest routes, where airlines needed not flexibility, but maximum transport density. There was logic in that. The problem was that Boeing did not try to build an answer in the same format. The company had already attempted to promote the 747X, a larger and more modern version of the 747, but failed to get the support it had hoped for. Airlines listened, showed interest, but were in no hurry to take on rigid commitments. In the end, Boeing abandoned the idea of another super jumbo and effectively admitted that the future might not be where it had long seemed obvious. Then the most important thing happened. Boeing did not simply refuse to play the same game, but began pushing the market in the opposite direction. After the Sonic Cruiser, which also never made it into serial production, the company used the work it had done for a completely different aircraft. That is how the 787 Dreamliner appeared. And it was precisely this product that strategically began destroying the need for the A380, because the 787 was not just selling new technology, but a new model of long-haul transportation, a smaller aircraft with lower fuel burn, modern materials, new engines, and the ability to open long routes between cities that previously did not have enough demand for that. That was the main blow to the A380. Airbus was betting on the concentration of passengers in major hubs, while Boeing was giving airlines a tool that allowed them to partially move away from that concentration. If before, a carrier often had to funnel passenger flows through one large hub in order to fill a wide-body long-haul aircraft, the 787 created another possibility, opening direct flights between less obvious city pairs, not forcing passengers through two connecting legs, but flying non-stop. That changed the very logic of the route network. And if the market begins moving toward a greater number of point-to-point routes, then a giant aircraft built for a hub-to-hub model automatically loses part of its purpose. All of this became even harder for Airbus because the A380 itself turned into an extremely difficult aircraft to build. The program was hit by delays, technical problems, and huge cost overruns. One of the most famous issues involved the wiring. Different teams were using different software versions, and when major sections came together, parts of the systems did not fit properly. Airbus was losing time, money, and most importantly, its moment. While the A380 was being delayed, Boeing was strengthening its position as the company that better matched the new needs of airlines. And even when the A380 finally entered service, it became clear that its economics only worked in almost ideal conditions. Airbus was right that a full A380 could deliver attractive seat costs, but in real airline economics, that was not enough. To keep such a huge aircraft full, airlines needed either enormous demand or lower fares. That meant they could save on cost per seat but lose on revenue. On a few ultra-dense routes, the model worked. Across the wider market, it did not. That is why the A380 never became a universal aircraft for most airlines. Against that background, the 787 looked far more practical. It did not require airlines to fill 500 seats every flight, did not need special infrastructure at dozens of airports, and did not force an entire network to be built around it. It could be used on many more routes and matched much more precisely to real demand. From a business point of view, it was a far safer bet. Boeing won not through spectacle, but through strategic precision. The A380 also suffered from a huge infrastructure barrier. Airports had to invest heavily in gates, jet bridges, taxiways, apron space, and ground handling. So Airbus had to convince not only airlines, but airports as well. The 787 required nothing like that. It fit much more naturally into existing infrastructure. When the market compared the two approaches, the difference was obvious. One aircraft demanded adaptation, while the other could begin generating value almost immediately. In the end, the A380 turned out to be a very good aircraft for a very narrow set of scenarios. Emirates was the clearest example. For an airline built around one giant hub in Dubai and massive transit flows, the aircraft made sense. But Airbus's problem was that global aviation does not run on the Emirates model. Most airlines did not need a symbol of scale. They needed a flexible tool for managing routes, demand, and costs. That was exactly what Boeing offered. So the A380 did not lose because it was technically weak or unpopular with passengers. On the contrary, it was one of the most impressive civil aircraft of its era. But Boeing made a more important move. It pushed the market toward a model in which the A380's strengths no longer mattered enough. In that sense, Boeing really did strategically kill the A380, not by attacking it directly, but by changing the direction of long-haul aviation itself. The problem was also that Airbus held on too long to an idea that was already losing support. While Boeing promoted the 787 as the aircraft for a new era of long direct routes, Airbus kept acting for some time as if the A380 represented the future. That was one of its biggest mistakes. It did not just bet on a very large aircraft. It realized too late that the market wanted something very different. Airbus's reaction to the 787 was especially revealing. At first, it did not see it as the threat it would later become. The A330 still looked strong, and Boeing's new aircraft seemed like only a partial shift. But airlines wanted more than another wide body. They wanted a new generation of long-haul aircraft. Lighter, more efficient, more modern, and more flexible in route planning. The stronger interest in the 787 became, the clearer it was that the A380 could not answer that demand. Eventually, Airbus had to respond, but at first it relied on half measures. Instead of immediately building a true competitor, it offered limited upgrades that failed to impress the market. Airlines were not waiting for cosmetic improvements. They wanted a genuinely new aircraft. That is how Airbus eventually arrived at the A350, but by then it had already lost time and money. More importantly, it exposed an uncomfortable truth. While Airbus was publicly promoting the A380 as the future, the market was forcing it to build an aircraft based on the opposite idea. That is what makes the A380 story so revealing. Airbus ended up supporting two opposite visions of aviation at once. One was the A380, a giant four-engine aircraft built for the busiest hubs. The other was the A350, a modern twin-engine widebody aimed at the very market Boeing was reshaping with the 787. In other words, Airbus itself was being pushed away from the logic on which the A380 had originally been built. In practice, Airbus had no easy way to win. If it stayed loyal to the A380, it remained tied to a segment that was no longer becoming mainstream. If it shifted toward the A350, it was effectively admitting that Boeing had read the market earlier and better. The A350 became a major success, but by then the A380 had already turned from a supposed aircraft of the future into a highly specialized and very expensive product. That is why Boeing had already won strategically long before the A380 story ended. It did not try to beat Airbus with a bigger aircraft or another super jumbo. Instead, it gave airlines something more important, a plane that changed the logic of choice. Once airlines began prioritizing flexibility, efficiency, and direct routes over maximum capacity on hub routes, the A380 was no longer losing because of one flaw. It was losing because the whole market was moving in another direction. That was the A380's biggest problem. For most airlines, it was simply too narrow a tool. To make it work profitably, carriers needed a huge and stable passenger flow on specific routes. That is why it suited Emirates so well. But very few other airlines had the same scale, structure, or concentration of traffic. For everyone else, smaller long-haul aircraft made far more sense. Even if the A380 lowered seat costs, It still required filling an enormous number of seats every time. If demand weakened, the economics quickly became worse. Boeing gave airlines exactly the alternative they needed. The 787 allowed them to match the aircraft to the route, not the route to the aircraft. Another weakness was the secondary market. Aircraft like the 737, 777, or A330 usually have a resale path if one airline retires them. The A380 did not. When early aircraft began leaving service, demand for used examples was extremely weak. It was still the same large, expensive, highly specialized aircraft that did not fit most route networks. That made it far less flexible and far less liquid than other wide bodies. In the end, Boeing did not destroy the A380 with one single move. It gradually pushed the market toward a world where the A380's strengths mattered less and less. While Airbus promoted the idea of an ultra-large flagship for the busiest hubs, Boeing offered airlines a more universal long-haul tool. Once carriers began choosing more efficient and more flexible aircraft at scale, the market had effectively made its decision. That is why the ending was so revealing. The A380 did not fail overnight, and it was not a technical disaster. Passengers loved it, it performed well, and for a few airlines it was genuinely valuable. The real problem was that too few operators and too few routes needed it enough to justify a program of that size. So Boeing strategically killed the A380 not by building a bigger aircraft, but by offering a different model of long-haul aviation. And once that model began to dominate, the A380 stopped looking like the future and became a symbol of a very expensive bet that did not pay off.